All right, so this is going to be the big one. I want to talk about trains and railroads specifically. And first, I talked about what was going on in East Palestine, Ohio, and the news coming out of there is just getting progressively worse and worse. And so, you get to a conversation about, well, what do we do about the railroads, right? Clearly there is some level of regulatory capture going on, where the lobbyists have convinced Department of Transportation to not do particular things. There's an over-reliance on what is now effectively ancient technology, right? I mean, stuff from the Civil War era, that's a joke. And so the question becomes, when an industry is so broken, what do you do to fix them? Because regulation seems to be off the table, and they're obviously not going to police themselves. So the answer, in my opinion, for this particular industry is to nationalize railroads. And so before I talk about what I think that would look like, I want to talk about why. And I know I mentioned a couple of things, but I want to talk like super specific items that lead me to believe that nationalization is the right way to go. So the first is, private industry has failed to do its job appropriately. And so if we think from a fundamental level, it's to get goods from A to B in a manner to make sure that all the goods are intact from A to B, right? And so things like derailments, things like not having functioning infrastructure, those things create a situation where obviously the industry has failed to do its purported job, right? Railroads are actually not about making profits for shareholders, although in private hands that appears to be primarily what they do. But that's not really what railroads are supposed to do. Railroads are a part of infrastructure, right? And if you think about the other types of infrastructure that we have in, my country or your country or whatever, railroads have been a large part of that since the 1800s. But there was an active decision to give that obligation to private companies and to let them compete for predominance over the railroads. In the U.S., there was a famous when they were building. There was a famous competition between a couple of railroad companies when they were building the railways that would cross the United States. And so the U.S. government, and this is just a bit of history, the U.S. government essentially said to two companies, and one of them is Union Pacific, and I don't remember what the other one is off the top of my head, but I used to know, so I apologize. I think it was Atlantic something. But anyway, they said, hey, you guys start on opposite ends of the country, and we'll, whoever can get more railway laid will get, preference in contracts and things like that. And so they set to work creating these rail lines across the country until eventually they met. And there's a famous picture somewhere of the two trains actually meeting. And remember, trains back then were going like 5 miles an hour. So it's not like, they didn't crash into each other or whatever. The construction teams met up essentially in not exactly the middle. And so railway is a huge, important piece of infrastructure, but we've privatized almost all of it. And so, it's difficult to conceive of other forms of infrastructure that are this important being privatized. So for example, could you imagine if every road was private? You would have to imagine the street that you live on. Now, humorously enough, I happen to live on a private street, and so I am actually partially responsible for the upkeep of this street. But if you live on the vast majority of roads in America or elsewhere, you pay taxes, and the city or the state or the county or whatever, the local jurisdiction, pays for a service to come out and maintain the roads and put the pipes in and all that good stuff, right? What if water infrastructure was all privatized, right? Then every time something went wrong, someone would bill you, as opposed to your taxes going into a large pool of money that allows these things to be repaired. And on it goes, right? And so infrastructure is one of those things where it just kind of makes sense for all of us to pool our money together, which is what taxes are, right? And to have these items go forward as a community, and to make sure that no one gets left behind, right? Because they're, they can't afford it, or they fall on hard times, or whatever it's going to be. And so that's another reason that we should move towards nationalization. And so, when we think about things that private industry does, like, I talked a little earlier about how they're failing their job, right? What's interesting is that a story came out related to Norfolk Southern. Sorry, I'm going to struggle with that this whole video. Is that there were actually concerns internally by their shareholders about the safety practices at Norfolk Southern. And what's interesting is that typically in a publicly held corporation, the shareholders get the final say, right? But the company actually fought off its own shareholders to make sure they didn't have to spend money on safety measures. So not only have they failed to do their job, but they've even failed to conform to market forces, because, and again, in capitalism, that's what's supposed to help regulate things, right? The invisible hand of capitalism changes things, helps to make better things. And you'd think that so, and you'd think that shareholders would have the power, but in this case, they didn't. So let's talk a little bit more about, about derailments and railroad companies and things like that. So what's interesting is that just since the Norfolk Southern derailment on February 3rd, there have been half a dozen, at least, more derailments. So in Pennsylvania, specifically Philadelphia, in Detroit, Mississippi, in Alabama, Alaska, Texas, and Louisiana, there have all been derailments. And specifically in Nebraska, there was a toxic chemical derailment like there was in East Palestine. And so now there's an investigation going on there. And by the way, who was primarily responsible for these derailments? Norfolk Southern. Starting to see a pattern here, huh? And so it's, these private companies are not going to be able to convince me that they can do the job, right? We keep having derailments. You're not doing the job. We have toxic chemicals spilling out. You're clearly not getting the cargo to where it has to go. If we look just specifically at East Palestine, Ohio, there were reports coming out of there about whether the water is safe to drink. Well, so it turns out Norfolk Southern hired the company that did the test of the water to tell them that the water was good to drink. Meanwhile, frogs and foxes and fish are turning up dead everywhere they drink the water. I don't know about you, I wouldn't drink that water. And if I lived in East Palestine, Ohio, I certainly wouldn't anymore. I would get the hell out of Dodge. I mean, it's just so irresponsible. And the company, Norfolk Southern, is a corporation, right? And I've talked about this so many times on this show, but the only purpose that a corporation serves to do is to maximize profits for its shareholders. They're just money-making machines, okay? And so they are going to do whatever they can to cut costs. They're going to lie if they have to so they don't get sued, right? Because look, man, let's be honest. This is an exercise to reduce liability of Norfolk Southern versus the people of Ohio who want to sue them and should sue them for all they're worth. I mean, especially when the company was offering $5 a person to repay the town. I mean, and by the way, they weren't even going to give it to the people. They were going to give it to like the Red Cross, which, fine, but that's not compensation for the massive detriment you caused in people's lives. And so, let's look at some other things. Interestingly, and I'm sure you've heard all the stories about there not being regulations on these particular types of brakes that have to be done, and the regulations on train brakes aren't particularly robust. And David Sirota at The Lever has done some great reporting about a 2012 derailment that caused a fuss, and that people really wanted there to be regulations about these brakes on these hazardous trains. But you had one administration start to get the rule going, then the Trump administration got rid of the rule, and now we're here, right? It's been 8 years at least, and we're in Biden's term, and there's still no rule, and we're just kind of moving forward inertia. But the other thing is, there's no regulations on length of trains either. So if you're Norfolk Southern and you're trying to maximize profit, one of the things you're going to do to reduce the amount of cost you have, because that's primarily where they lose money, is you're just going to be adding cars and cars and cars. And what's interesting is that there was an interview with a former federal regulator, and what she had said was that she was voicing concerns when the industry was using 70 and 80 car trains. And now these trains are over 150 cars long. And so, and by the way, it's just going to get worse. Again, they're not listening to their workers who are telling them that these practices are dangerous. It turns out the East Palestine, Ohio train actually had a fire on it as it was going through Pennsylvania, which they put out and then kept the train going like nothing happened. People of East Palestine, Ohio did not know that the train had caught fire before it got to them. And so, again, this is all about how can we spend the least amount of money to make the most amount of money? And in something like this, where you're transporting dangerous chemicals, where you're operating infrastructure, which, by the way, as we learned during the potential rail strike, carries $2 billion of goods every day across this country. And now we also have a very interesting case where the railroad companies are attempting to make even less liability for themselves by suing to invalidate a Pennsylvania statute that requires them to be sued in Pennsylvania. So I want to get a little bit more into this case, because it's important to talk about kind of how ridiculous this is. So there's a principle in the law, and it varies from state to state, and it doesn't have a common name. But essentially, the idea is, if you operate in a state, so if you go, set up a shop in, Kentucky, for example, people who use your service are allowed to sue you in Kentucky, which makes logical sense, right? Now, if your business is incorporated in Kentucky, but you also have a shop in, say, like Missouri, I'm making stuff up, right? It also says that if you've incorporated that shop to operate in Missouri, then you also have to be able to be sued there. And everywhere where you do business, you can be sued in. And by the way, this rule has been in effect for like 200 years at this point. Like, this is common sense. But this case has been escalated to the Supreme Court. The railroad companies are so desperate to avoid being sued by all the people that they've hurt. And by the way, that water from East Palestine is going to trickle down to major rivers that go all throughout the southeastern United States, and that is going to cause havoc. And people are going to die who are really far from East Palestine and from Ohio in general. So they all are going to want to sue Norfolk Southern as well, and they see the writing on the wall. So they're like, hey, why don't we invalidate this 200-year-old rule? And you'd think, oh, well, Ben, obviously a court of law is not going to allow that to proceed. Well, you would hope that, right? But the Biden administration, for no discernible reason, and I mean none at all, has decided that they are going to come in to the case on the side of the railroads. So now, I don't necessarily trust the government to do the right thing all the time, and I don't think you should either. But that being said, why would, the Biden administration would not have a lawsuit to come in to help if the railroad companies hadn't sued in the first place, right? And so, am I mad at Biden and the Democrats for doing the wrong thing here? Yes, I am. Am I more upset at the railroad companies and the private interests that are driving that lawsuit to say, hey, what if we invalidated pretty much 200 years of jurisprudence to save our asses for a second? Yeah, more mad at that. So now that I've talked about all the reasons that I think we should nationalize the railroads, and I still continue to believe that we should nationalize the railroads, I want to talk a little bit about what that would look like. So earlier I mentioned highways, right? And by the way, just so you're aware, the government has nationalized industries before. During World War II, there was going to be a large steel strike, and the government enacted a law that allowed it to temporarily nationalize the steel industry for the purpose of avoiding the strike, right? And so part of what that means is, you'd still have kind of all the corporate structures, more or less, but the government would just kind of take over at the heads. And since the government is not interested in a profit model, you'd kind of move towards a sustainability model. And in theory, you could get some improvements that way. The other way that you could do nationalization is you could totally break apart all of these corporations, essentially get rid of all of the overhead that is not required to run the trains, migrate all of the employees who actually operate the trains and do the day-to-day even the accountants and things like that, the mapping of routes, what have you, into the Department of Transportation, who would then directly oversee and make rules for an industry that they run. Now, that would be an interesting choice because it would allow for the workers to have a much more direct connection to the organization that is making the rules for their industry, right? And in some ways, that could actually lead to workers having a larger seat at the table when it comes to, how rail regulations are created, how rail safety is observed, and all that good stuff. It's not necessarily means that that's going to be the case, but it does mean that it's possible, just given how close those organizations will be. The other thing too is that once you nationalize, so you can take either one of those routes, right? And I'm sure there's other routes that I'm not thinking of, but those are the two primary ones. Once you nationalize an industry, that industry then, in a sense, becomes accountable to the people, to the extent that politics is still accountable to the people, right? I've talked about this on a number of occasions. But essentially, in theory, what happens is that, candidates for office can run on rail regulations, or expanding the railroads, or contracting the railroads, or changing the way that the rails run, right? It becomes a policy issue that we debate in the public forum, as opposed to being a corporate board decision that says, what decision can we make now to make us the most money in the short term, right? And so we would fundamentally rethink the way that we think about railroads. And by the way, it would not be so unusual, right? As I mentioned earlier, it would be essentially like having national highways, which is, you might pay a little bit in taxes to use them. You might pay tolls in some areas, but for the most part, there's an understanding that we, the people, own the highways, or we, the people, would then own the railways, right? Just as an example. And so that would fundamentally shift the way that we approach these things. And I honestly believe that taking the profit motive out of this would encourage the new owners, as in the people or the government, to make the trains much safer. Not just because it would be much easier to point the finger and create accountability in the government if something goes terribly wrong. And so there's kind of a natural avoidance factor there, but also government doesn't really care about profits, right? So all that money coming in, the question would be, what do we use it for? And they might say, well, actually, we need an infrastructure project that creates more railroads, or puts more trains on the tracks, or hires more conductors, or this, or whatever, right? And so all the money that's being used to give money to shareholders, to give money to high-paid executives, most of that obligation disappears. And so that money is then opened up to be used for other things. And by the way, if the government could also use it for like a reparations program. Hey, we understand that historically railroads have been placed in places that displace individuals. Oftentimes, those are disadvantaged individuals for other reasons, and that's why the rail line was put there. Here's reparations from that, right? Or, you could use that money for a direct reparations for people who happen to be the subject of train accidents, even when the trains are doing the things that they're supposed to do, right? So there's lots of options. Ultimately, though, the most important thing that nationalization does is it gets rid of the profit motive, and it gets rid of the greed, and it gets rid of the dark shadows too. You create accountability. And again, I understand the government's not perfect, and you've heard me criticize the government on a number of occasions. I did it in this video, in this episode. But that all being said, It's time. We have witnessed over the course of 10 years a disgusting failure of private industry to do its job, to keep people safe, to deliver the goods it needs to do, to respect its workers, and to make sure that the trust that we have placed in it is well kept. And it just isn't. So the way that this would happen, nationalization that is you'd pass a law, right? Or someone would propose a law. So, if you are a lawmaker and watching this, which you probably aren't, but write something up, right? The government has the power to do this. You could use a version of eminent domain. At the state level, if you're a state level politician, you can just write a bill under the Commerce Clause that says you can nationalize the railroads. It's definitely, railroads are most certainly interstate commerce. You could definitely seize them. And by the way, while we're at it, let's throw some of these executives in jail who are intentionally making decisions that kill people. It should be a crime. But anyway, this was kind of the long, deep dive I wanted to take into the railroads and nationalization. I hope you found it interesting. I spent a lot of time thinking about what the best way to approach this was, and I'm kind of happy where it went. So interested to see what your all commentary is. But nationalize the railroads, make the union stronger, and make all of us and our communities safer. Thank you so much for watching this video from Let Them Eat Bread. If you enjoyed this content, please like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Check us out on Twitch and on Facebook, where announcements about our page are kept. We make videos every week, and you can find all of our videos at youtube.com/LetThemEatBread. Thanks again, and see you next time.